What's up, fellow polymaths? In this video of the Java Fundamentals tutorial, we'll be going over generics. Generics enable programmers to specify with a single method declaration a set of related methods, or a single class declaration a set of related types, respectively. Generics also provide compile time type safety that allows programmers to catch invalid types at compile time. As an example of the power of generics, we can write a generic method for sorting an array of objects that then call the generic method with integer arrays, double arrays, string arrays, and so on to sort the array elements, allowing for more dynamic programming. So essentially, generics allows you a way to create classes and methods that are very dynamic. So instead of a method only returning a specific data type or object, generic allows for being able to return dynamic data types or objects. You can write a single generic method declaration that can be called with the arguments of different types. Based on the types of the arguments passed to the generic method, the compiler handles each method call appropriately. So the rules for generic methods: all generic method declarations have a type parameter section delimited by the angle brackets that precede the method's return type. Each type parameter section contains one or more type parameters separated by commas. A type parameter, also known as a type variable, is an identifier that specifies a generic type name. The type parameters can be used to declare the return type and act as placeholders for the type of the arguments passed into the generic method, which are known as actual type arguments. A generic method's body is similar to any other method. Note that type parameters can represent only reference types and not primitive types. And as we see in our example, in the method, we have the angle brackets with the t in between the static and the void, and the parameters also contain the t as that act as the data types for the arguments. So we're going to get into code very shortly, but just want to mention a bit more about generics. So there might be an occasion where you want to restrict the type of parameters that are allowed to pass in a type parameter. To declare a bounded type parameter, you list the type parameter's name followed by the extends keyword followed by its upper bound. Alright, so now that we have a brief understanding about generics, let's test this out in the code. Alright, so here we're in the code editor, and what we're going to do is make a generic method. And this generic method will allow us to return different types of values regardless of what object it is. Alright, so I created a method called output elements, and it's a generic method, and this output elements method takes in an array input that's a dynamic array. It'll be able to take an array input of a dynamic data type. So after this, all I have to do is just create a simple output in the method that'll output the result that we want from the array input. Alright, so in this method I create a for each loop, and basically what it's doing is that for each value in that array input, I'm going to loop through each index of that array, and then it'll output the value of each element in that array on its own line. So now that I've created the method, let's output this to the main method and then run the code. Alright, so I created some array variables with different data types, and we're going to be outputting these variables into the output elements array as the parameter. Alright, so now we have the methods for the output elements, and we're passing in the variables that we created on line 7 and 11. So let's run this right now and we'll see what happens. Alright, so you run the output and see here that based on one method with a dynamic data type, we're able to output various data type values regardless of what data type it is. So we're able to pass in booleans, shorts, integers, doubles, strings, and we could also pass in other objects as well. But this is just a brief example. Now that we've seen this, let's go over what's going on. Alright, so first we created this method right here that's a public static generic avoid output elements, and it passes in a generic data type called array input. In this method we have a for each loop, and the for each loop says that for a generic values of array from the array input, so the array input that we passed in, we're going to output all those values from that array input, and regardless of whatever data type it is. So this t represents that generic data type. So over in the main method, we define 5 variables that are arrays. One's a boolean, short, integer, double, and string, and note that they're all reference data types rather than primitive data types, noting the capital letters. So after we've defined the arrays, then we just signify what represents what variable. So here is a boolean, it represents the bool array. So in this output elements array that we created, it passes in that bool array from line 7 and then outputs it from by each line all the values of the Boolean array. And then we do the same for the short, integer, double, and string. So that's a relatively simple overview of how to utilize generic methods. Generics are a very powerful way to be able to make methods as well as classes more dynamic. Try some out on your own, and you'll be able to understand it a lot more. So going over generic classes, a generic class declaration is similar to a non-generic class declaration, except that the class name is followed by a type parameter selection, such as the one that we defined before with the angle brackets. Like generic methods, the type parameter section of a generic class can have one or more type parameters separated by commas. These type classes are known as parameterized classes or parameterized types because they accept at least one parameter. So let's test this out in the code. Alright, so here I'm going to create a new class called generic classes. And then in that generic class that I created, we're going to implement that generic class. No pun intended. Alright, so I created a generic class, and pretty much all we have to do to define it as generic is just add the angle brackets and then whatever value that you want. In this case, I'm just adding a t. And here we're going to define a private variable and then a public method that returns that private variable. Alright, so I created the methods, which are pretty much setters and getters for the dynamic methods, which are both generics. The set value passes in a generic value variable, and the get value is a generic data type that returns the value. So now that we've done this, let's go into the main method and call these methods. Alright, so I'm in the main method, and what we're going to do is create 3 variables with different object data types. One will be an integer, one will be a double, and one will be a string. Alright, so we created our 3 variables. We have an integer, a double, and a string that come from the generic class. And as you notice, you've seen from the collections framework video, it looks similar to the collections classes that we dealt with the array list, linked list, and hash sets, and so on. So generics act in a somewhat similar way as well. Alright, so now that I've created the 3 objects, we're going to be calling those methods that we created in that generic class. Alright, so now we've used those objects that we created on line 7 and 9, and we're now calling those methods that we created in the generic class, the set value and the get values. So let's run this right now and see what the result is. Okay, so we ran the code and we see our output says integer is 9,000, double is 184,500.0, and generics shows as generics in capitalization and exclamation points. That's a pretty simple example of how you use generics using classes. Again, test this out on your own. There's more you can do with generics. Generics are very useful if you want to have a class or a method that does something similarly regardless of whatever data type or object that you're passing in. Alright, here's our assignment for this topic. Number 1, name 2 benefits of generics. Number 2, what delimiter is used to denote a generic method or class. Number 3, write a small program that uses a generic method. Make that method be called by at least 3 different classes. If this video was of any value to you, then please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.